Friends, it just happened. Prince William, the future King of England, the heir to a throne that has stood for over 1,000 years, looked directly at the most powerful, unelected woman in Europe and said 6 words that have sent Brussels into a panic so total, so complete, and so publicly visible that veteran diplomatic observers are struggling to find a historical comparison that even comes close. 6 words, not a policy statement, not a diplomatic communique, not a carefully measured expression of concern routed through Foreign Office channels. 6 words delivered with the full moral weight of 1,000 years of history, a family that has survived wars and empires and the collapse of entire world orders, and a personal fury that no amount of royal protocol could contain. Ursula von der Leyen, you are an unelected woman. That is what he said, out loud, on the record, in front of the entire world. And the moment those words left his mouth, something inside the European Commission broke. Not cracked, not strained, broke, because Prince William did not just insult a bureaucrat. He did not just defend his family against an institutional attack. He named the thing that the entire architecture of European power had spent decades carefully preventing anyone with enough standing to be heard from ever saying clearly. Von der Leyen was never chosen by the people of Europe. She was never voted for, never elected, never subjected to the democratic accountability that every ordinary politician must face. She holds power over the lives of 450 million people, and not a single one of them ever had the chance to say no. Prince William just said it for them. And Europe will never be the same. To understand why Prince William's statement has triggered a crisis that the European Commission has absolutely no framework to contain, you have to understand what Brussels did before he spoke. Because those 6 words did not arrive without cause. They arrived as the response to something so breathtakingly arrogant, so deliberately provocative, and so catastrophically miscalculated that even experienced European diplomats who have spent careers defending the Commission's institutional judgment are struggling to explain how the decision was ever made. The European Commission went after the crown, not British trade policy, not a bilateral regulatory disagreement, not a dispute over border arrangements or financial market access or any of the 100 technical frameworks that govern the practical relationship between Britain and the continent it chose to leave. They reached past all of that and attacked the institution that sits at the absolute and irreplaceable center of British national identity. They declared King Charles III constitutionally illegitimate. They stated openly on the official record, in formal institutional capacity, that the King of the United Kingdom holds no real authority over matters that intersect with European political and economic interests. That his role is ceremonial at best and obstructive at worst, that he represents an obstacle to the kind of modern European political order that Brussels has spent decades trying to construct across the continent. And then, as if that were not sufficient provocation for a nation that has been governed by its monarchy for over 1,000 years, they went further. They demanded his removal from any position of influence over matters touching European interests. Not a request, not a diplomatic suggestion delivered quietly through back channels, a public demand directed at the King of the United Kingdom by an institution whose president was never elected by a single citizen of any nation. The assumption inside Brussels when that decision was made was as simple as it was catastrophically wrong. The assumption was that post-Brexit Britain had been sufficiently weakened and sufficiently isolated by the political and economic consequences of leaving the European Union that it would absorb the insult without effective response. That the royal family, bound by centuries of deeply held tradition around political neutrality and institutional restraint, would retreat into dignified silence, that the palace would issue nothing, that the political class in London would manage the diplomatic fallout through the quiet back channels that professionals on both sides of the channel had spent years maintaining, that the monarchy would sit above the storm and allow it to pass without descending into the kind of direct institutional confrontation that European officials had calculated the crown would never risk. Every single element of that assumption was wrong. wrong in its reading of British political culture, wrong in its assessment of how much post-Brexit Britain would tolerate from an institution it had specifically chosen to leave, wrong in its fundamental misunderstanding of what the Crown means to the British people at a level that goes so far beneath politics and economics and diplomatic frameworks that Brussels, which had always analyzed Britain as a trading unit and a regulatory problem, had never developed the capacity to see it clearly. The Crown is not a government department. It is not a policy position subject to institutional challenge through normal political mechanisms. It is not a historical relic that modern Britain maintains out of ceremonial habit. It is something that the British people carry inside themselves, woven into their understanding of who they are and where they come from across 1,000 years of continuous national story. When the European Commission attacked the Crown, they did not attack a building or a title or a constitutional function. They attacked the identity of an entire nation. And the response came not from a politician, not from a trade official, not from the measured and carefully calibrated machinery of British diplomatic response. It came from a prince. Prince William did not wait for advisors to draft a response architecture. He did not convene meetings to assess the appropriate diplomatic register for a formal reply. He did not consult communications teams about how to express displeasure while preserving future negotiating room with European partners. He responded the way a man responds when something he loves and something he has sworn his life to protect has been publicly and deliberately desecrated. He responded with the full weight of his name, his family's history, his future role, and his personal fury compressed into 6 words that carried more political force than any formal statement any European leader has issued in years. Ursula von der Leyen is an unelected woman. That is what he said, not as a casual political observation, not as a rhetorical flourish designed to generate headlines for a news cycle, as a verdict, as a statement of fundamental and indisputable political truth that the entire architecture of European institutional power had spent years carefully preventing from being said too clearly by anyone with enough standing to make it impossible to dismiss. Because the moment it was said by someone the world was watching, by someone carrying the moral authority of a 1,000-year institution defending itself against a 50-year one, the entire scaffolding of unaccountable European power suddenly became visible in a way that Brussels had no mechanism to render invisible again. Von der Leyen was not elected by the citizens of Europe. That is not a political opinion. It is not a populist talking point. It is not dangerous nationalism dressed in constitutional language. It is a simple, verifiable, indisputable fact. She was selected behind closed doors by a group of political elites who negotiated among themselves about who should hold the most powerful administrative position on the continent and then presented their choice to a European Parliament that ratified it through a process that no ordinary European citizen meaningfully participated in. She holds authority over the lives of 450 million people. She makes decisions that reshape the economies, the borders, the regulatory environments, and the strategic directions of 27 sovereign nations. She negotiates on behalf of an entire continent with the most powerful governments on earth, and not one ordinary voter in any European country ever cast a ballot with her name on it. Prince William made that fact impossible to ignore, and by making it impossible to ignore, he did something that extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic confrontation between Britain and Brussels. He handed every citizen across the European continent who had ever felt that the Commission operated beyond accountability, beyond democratic reach, and beyond the consequences that elected politicians must face, he handed all of them a language, a clarity, a moment where someone with enough standing to be heard by the entire world said out loud what they had been carrying privately for years. The shock inside Brussels was not simply about the personal insult to von der Leyen. The shock was about what the insult revealed. Prince William had not just attacked her personally, he had attacked the legitimacy of the entire structure she represents. And he had done it using facts, not allegations, not political spin, facts. And facts delivered by someone of his standing in defense of a king that Europe had just publicly declared illegitimate are not something that a press release or a diplomatic clarification can undo. The British public did not simmer. It erupted. Within hours of Prince William's statement reaching every platform, every channel and every conversation across the country. The public response reached a scale and a unity that political analysts described as unlike anything measurable in the post-Brexit era. Social media exploded with a speed that overwhelmed every attempt at narrative management from Brussels. Hashtags supporting King Charles and Prince William dominated every platform simultaneously. Comment sections that normally fracture along every familiar fault line of British political life, left against right, Remain against Leave, North against South, Young against Old, unified with a coherence that almost never occurs in modern democracies, because Europe had achieved something that British domestic politics almost never manages on its own. It had given every faction, every region, every demographic, every political tribe something they all agreed on simultaneously. It had given them a common enemy, an enemy with a face, a name, an office in Brussels, and 6 words of royal verdict hanging over her head that the entire nation had heard and understood and felt in the same way at the same moment. That kind of unified national emotion is extraordinarily rare. It is also extraordinarily dangerous to anyone on the receiving end of it. And von der Leyen, who had spent her political career navigating the complex, multi-directional pressures of European institutional politics, had never been on the receiving end of anything like it. Inside 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was watching the public response with the precise attention of a politician who understands that when the ground beneath your feet shifts at this speed and this scale, you have exactly 2 choices available. You move with it or you get buried under it. Sunak had spent years threading the extraordinarily delicate needle of Britain's post-Brexit European relationship. Patient, careful, methodical work constructing small functional agreements where large structural ones had become politically impossible, maintaining intelligence and security cooperation where trade frameworks had broken down, keeping communication channels open even when the political temperature on both sides made that effort deeply uncomfortable and politically costly. That entire body of careful, patient work had been rendered irrelevant in a single morning, not because it was misguided, but because Europe had made it irrelevant with one act of political miscalculation so staggering in its arrogance that no amount of diplomatic maintenance work could survive it as the operating framework for British-European relations. The emergency cabinet meeting that Sunak convened within hours was not assembled to debate whether Britain should respond. Prince William had already responded. The British public had already responded. The question of whether Britain would react had been settled before the cabinet room filled. The question the room was there to answer was the one that would define the next chapter of British history. How far was Britain actually prepared to go? And the answer that emerged from that room over the hours that followed was an answer that European leaders had genuinely never believed they would be required to hear from a post-Brexit Britain they had spent years describing as isolated, weakened, and dependent on European goodwill for its economic survival. Britain was prepared to go all the way. And the preliminary assessment of exactly what all the way meant for European economies arrived back on British government desks within 24 hours. What it showed shook every assumption that had governed European thinking about post-Brexit Britain since the morning the referendum results came in. And when those numbers reached Berlin and Paris, the alarm that followed was not the measured institutional concern of governments managing a diplomatic complication. It was the visceral alarm of governments that had just discovered they had been operating on a fundamental miscalculation about their own economic exposure, and that the prince standing in defense of his king had just given the most economically consequential nation they had underestimated every reason to act on that exposure without restraint. What exactly did those numbers show? And why did Germany's industrial lobby reach its political leadership before the diplomatic briefings had even been completed? The numbers that came back from Britain's emergency trade review did not arrive with the gradual accumulation of a standard governmental assessment. They arrived with the concentrated force of a reality that had been carefully obscured by a decade of European political narrative, and was now, under the pressure of a genuine crisis, impossible to keep obscured any longer. The European Commission had spent years constructing and maintaining a specific story about post-Brexit Britain. The story was consistent, disciplined, and repeated across every institutional communication, every diplomatic briefing, and every economic assessment that Brussels produced about the British economy in the years following the referendum. The story said that Britain needed Europe, that the economic interdependence built across decades of EU membership had created a structural dependency that Brexit had not eliminated, but had instead made more painful and more costly to manage. That Britain's access to European markets, European supply chains, European financial frameworks, and European regulatory alignment was the invisible foundation beneath whatever prosperity post-Brexit Britain had managed to sustain. That foundation, the story insisted, was something Britain could not afford to jeopardize. That awareness of its existence was the quiet but constant constraint on how far British governments could push back against European institutional pressure without triggering consequences they could not absorb. The Emergency Trade Review destroyed that story with the clinical precision of an assessment conducted by people who were no longer operating under any political incentive to protect it. Britain's economic flexibility relative to European dependency was significantly greater than Brussels had ever publicly acknowledged. In critical sectors, the reverse dependency, Europe needing Britain, was not just comparable to Britain's exposure, but in several measurable areas exceeded it. The British financial services industry, the most globally connected and most deeply capitalized in Europe, provided infrastructure that European institutions and European corporations depended upon in ways that had no immediate alternative destination. British legal services, the preferred framework for international commercial contracts across the continent, could not be replicated through European alternatives on any timeline that European businesses could absorb without severe operational disruption. British defense industrial capacity, British intelligence sharing architecture, British participation in security frameworks that kept European nations safe from threat networks, they lacked the independent capability to monitor and counter